It is a pleasure to welcome you to today's virtual discussion. We hope that you, our community of colleagues, allies, and supporters around the globe are healthy and safe. Our offices are in New York, and today I'm speaking to you from Brooklyn, location situated upon the unceded seized territory of the Lenape and Canarsie peoples, and benefited from the economies of slavery and labors of African-descended captives. We owe our existence and vitality to generations from around the world who were brought here against their will, drawn here to escape persecution, and some that have lived on this land for more generations than can be counted. We pay respect to their communities past and present. This acknowledgement asks us each to consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that bring us together here today. The systemic violence and racism targeted at Black, Indigenous, and people of color is a harsh reminder of the inequities that persist in our society, particularly by the very institutions meant to protect them. AAMC condemns all violence, bias, aggression, and discrimination based on race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender, and religion. It is important to listen and learn together, and to also take action to make change a reality. AAMC's commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion, and access will continue to be a driving force of all our efforts. We call upon cultural organizations and the individuals working, funding, and serving them to take action to do better. We are dedicated to an environment in which all individuals are treated with respect and dignity at our programs. Each individual has the right to be in a professional atmosphere that prohibits discriminatory practices, including harassment. Our full code of conduct policy for this webinar and all our programs, as well as the outlets to make direct or anonymous report of violation, has been posted in the chat feature. For many years, we have been presenting virtual programming and documenting live events, all of which are accessible on our website at artcurators.org or our YouTube channel. We hope they provide actionable advice, value, and connectivity. You can also stay up to date on our programming by registering for our communications. We are grateful to all our attendees for making space in their schedule to join us. I also want to acknowledge our members here today and express our gratitude to them for their dedication in being part of our community. We give thanks to our speakers for sharing their experiences and knowledge in today's candid and open forum. Thank you again for joining us. And now to begin our program.
So hi everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on the topic of reshaping exhibitions in a socially distanced world. My name is Becky and I'll be the moderator of today's session, and I'm really looking forward to what I'm sure will be a really interesting and wide-ranging conversation. Today's webinar has been organised by this year's cohort of the AAMC Foundation's International Engagement Programme for Curators, which is generously supported by the Art Fund and the Terra Foundation for American Art. The programme fosters exchange and partnership between non-US based curators and US based curators, and aims to expand and strengthen the international curatorial community. Although the pandemic has meant that we have not yet been able to meet in person, the programme has offered us all many opportunities for fruitful discussion and collaboration, and we have enjoyed working together to plan this timely webinar. The format of today's sessions will be as follows. I will shortly provide brief introductions of our speakers, and please visit the AAMC website for more information. We will then have a 40-minute discussion led by questions drafted by the group, and we will then open up the webinar to questions. During the webinar, please submit questions and comments in the Zoom Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We will try and get through as many of these as we can. However, unfortunately, it might not be possible for us to get through all of them in the time that we have. We have a great lineup of speakers from the International Engagement Programme to discuss this topic today, and I would now like to take a moment to introduce them briefly. Julia Tatiana Bailey is Curator of Modern and Contemporary Art at the National Gallery, Prague. She specialises in the visual culture of the Cold War, with particular interest in art as diplomacy, propaganda, and resistance in Eastern Europe and the Americas. Laura Biddle is the Collection Coordinator of the Arts Council Collection in the UK, assisting in the curation and materialisation of national touring exhibitions, as well as an international loans and collections care programme. Chi Lai is a design anthropologist and a curator of design and decorative arts at the National Palace Museum in Taiwan, and has also curated the 2016 and 2017 NPM Asian Film Festivals. E. Carmen Ramos is the Smithsonian American Art Museum's acting chief curator and curator of Latinx art. Her upcoming fall 2020 exhibition is titled Printing the Revolution, the Rise and Impact of Chicano Graphics, 1965 to Now. In addition, to introduce myself briefly, I am one of the UK participants and I work at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. I am the lead curator for the New Collections Research Centre at V&A East, which will be opening to the public in 2023. In my role, I am responsible for curating a self-guided visitor route through the new centre, which will interrogate the museum's collecting history, profile the range of behind-the-scenes expertise at the museum, and provide unprecedented access to the store collections. In this role, I've been thinking a lot about the future of museums and how we can be a more welcoming, critical, and empathetic space that is truly inclusive and welcoming to all by effectively reinterpreting and redisplaying our permanent collections. However, the circumstances of this year and the dramatic shifts in both how arts organisations operate and how audiences experience cultural events has shown that these issues are more important than ever, particularly as many institutions face financial difficulties, reduced visitor numbers, and the pressing need to take an active role in responding to major issues such as the Black Lives Matter movement. As such, and among many other adaptations, museums are reshaping their approaches to conceiving, developing, and presenting exhibitions, whether they are original, touring, collection reinstallations, or in the digital realm. These approaches are wide-ranging and are on the one hand very practical and very physical considerations, which involve rethinking how spaces are used and experienced. However, they can and may also encompass rethinking the role of institutions more broadly by questioning who organisations are for and represent and how we foreground this through equitable acquisition practices. Although we are in a period of great upheaval and rapid change, this is also an opportunity for cultural institutions to be agile and embrace new ways of working. This webinar will question how arts organisations are responding to this year's events and beginning to reshape exhibitions for a socially distanced world. And we'll also discuss what the future of exhibition making might look like. So thank you all for today. And to begin, I'd like to ask all of you to tell us, how has your institution fared through the pandemic? And could you tell us how the public have been engaging with your collections during the sessions? Shall we start with Carmen?
Yes, thank you. Like many museums across the United States and the world until very recently, we were closed since the middle of March in order to ensure public and staff safety in light of the pandemic. Relatively speaking, I think our institution has fared fairly well. And several weeks ago, the Smithsonian started a phased reopening of our museums and units. My institution is actually reopening this Friday. And while our budget has and will continue to be impacted because of reductions in contributions, and especially for us, reductions in earned special events income, we have been able to keep our staff. So we feel obviously extremely lucky in light of the world today. Because we don't rely on admission fees, admissions is free at our museums and units. We didn't have to adjust to losing a major part of our revenue stream in an immediate way as well. I think from a curatorial perspective, one of the first pivots that we made at the start of the pandemic was to really try to ensure that our exhibitions that we had spent and invested a lot of time in organizing, really that we could keep them on view, and open them when we reopened. There were, so there was a lot of effort to sort of, rejigger loan agreements. There were some casualties. Hearts of Our People was a really important exhibition that opened just a few weeks before the pandemic really hit. This is an exhibition featuring the work of Native American women artists that was touring, organized by the Minneapolis Institute of Arts, and we were presenting it. And unfortunately, that exhibition was not seen at our venue by many people because of the pandemic. But we were able to extend loans and extend the exhibition dates for a major exhibition on Alexander von Humboldt that people will be able to see starting this Friday. And we, like other museums, really quickly moved to shift our public programs online. And it's something that we're going to continue to do into the foreseeable future, because even though our museums are opened, there are still restrictions on congregating large groups of people. And we've also really begun to initiate new online programs featuring our curators and collections and sharing that knowledge with our audiences. But really, I think the pandemic has really led to several departments really taking center stage, like our digital strategies team and our education team. And our education staff has really done what I consider to be a Herculean effort to really connect with our visitors in very, very meaningful ways that address some of the repercussions of the pandemic, especially for young people and communities caught in the digital divide. So as a community, as a museum community broadly defined, we've been very focusing on strengthening our digital resources, but we also need to be aware that there are some communities that still don't have access to digital resources. So we've been really trying to kind of in a very low-tech way, share some educational resources with, low-income students and families in the DC area, and really create sort of printed materials related to our collections, and really distribute those to national school audiences. And I think one of the surprising things for me about this period really has been the ways in which we've been able to connect with visitors around the world. So, while we're sort of stuck in our very local places, working in digital space has allowed us to reach audiences in places that we never thought imaginable.
Sorry, I wasn't unmuted. Thanks, Carmen. Laura, could you tell us a little bit about your institution?
Yeah, so I work for the Arts Council collection in the UK, which quite different to the other panelists. We don't have a permanent space, so we operate pretty much wholly for designing and materialising touring exhibitions, and also lending across the world. So we have, I guess, been lucky to be able to avoid a lot of the practical elements of dealing with visitors in a space. But yeah, on a more sort of ground level, we have, as Carmen said, we've also managed to avoid redundancies, which obviously has been brilliant, but very, very lucky. Staff-wise, we've kept it very, very minimum. We were completely closed during the peak in the UK, and we're now limiting it to essentially technicians on site at the store. So just so that we can keep loans ticking over now that things are starting to ramp up again. In terms of things that were able to change and I would say improve over lockdown, we're a very small team. We're spread over 2 sites, but we actually only have 2 members of staff who cover everything: digital, marketing, communications, absolutely everything. So our social media following and engagement has never probably been as high as we'd all have liked it to have done, just because our online capacity within the team isn't as high as many big institutions. But we also expected, I guess, that with the digital saturation of everybody going online, that what we did put online might not get seen by as many people because there was just so much great stuff out there. But actually our digital content has proved really successful, and our Instagram especially has gained a lot of followers. We did 2 online exhibitions with lending organisations. So we did one with, every year we help the Courtauld Masters students put on an exhibition using our collection. And we did that online, including a behind the scenes tour and installation video, which I think was a really nice way for people who aren't familiar with the arts to get a bit of a behind the scenes kind of access to what installing a show might be like. And we also did a moving image exhibition on our own website, which I think the team were really glad just to be able to get a little bit more visibility for some of the moving image work that we have, because it isn't amongst the most borrowed. So yeah, I think we've found that, I guess, wanting some escapism maybe. Online content has obviously been really popular. It's accessible for most. Obviously, we can't forget that there is a digital poverty gap, that, you know, not everybody can access it. But one interesting thing that we did find was that the biggest engagement we had by far was actually any announcement or blog regarding our new acquisitions. So every year we announce our acquisitions, and it's usually around April, but obviously that was just as everything royally kicked off in the UK. So we pushed that back to July, when we had announcements of our acquisitions and a new director as well. So I think people must have just loved really new content. I think obviously throughout the pandemic we've seen TV, well, certainly in the UK, I don't assume it's the same most places, TV shows, films have all had to go on hold. So there's a lot of repeats of Friends on the telly. Everything is old material. So I think people seeing things like new acquisitions coming into a national collection was something that was really valuable. And obviously pushing the idea that this belongs to people and it can be borrowed all over the country in places that aren't just art galleries. So I think the prospect of being able to see those things, hopefully in the near future, really engage people. So yeah, that was a big surprise, because I think we did expect that, having had initially not the biggest audience online, that the saturation of all the digital content would mean that we weren't that visible. But our digital team has done a really good job, and it's, I think the pandemic, if one good thing can be brought out of it, it's that I think we have managed to catch up with some of the digital content that we just weren't able to get out when we were sort of on this treadmill of everything else before the pandemic hit.
Great, thanks, Laura. Chi?
Hi, I'm Chi from National Palace Museum in Taiwan. We'll have like two branches in Taiwan, so I would like to use some images to give you some idea about my institution. Sorry, I can't. Maybe I have to do it again. Yep, here it is. Okay. So this might be a more familiar image for National Palace Museum for a lot of the international visitors. However, in 2015, we opened a new branch. This one is in Taipei. But in 2015, we opened a new branch. It's called Southern Branch of the National Palace Museum. It's in Jiayi. And the location of our new branch is actually around like a sugarcane field. So for a new museum like this, for just like 5 years old, with a much elder and more mature sister, or like man museum in Taipei for almost like 90 years old, over 90 years old. We face a lot of different challenges, especially during the pandemic, and we realize how different challenges we face. In the situation in Taiwan, we start to request all our staff and our visitor to wear face masks since January, because in early February, we do have some confirmed cases, visitors in our museum. So we start to kind of sanitize the whole museum and then start all those procedures in order to protect our staff as well as our visitors. So for visitor experience after the pandemic, all people have to come through the museum through controlled doors, and then we use infrared scan to monitor if there's someone having a fever to enter the museum, and we will kind of like take care of them. And also, so that is like the same policy for both branches. And during that period of time, we have a decline of visitors visiting our museum. So we kind of engage them virtually online. And at the time, there is a very popular game called Animal Crossing on the Nintendo Switch. So that is like quite popular throughout different age in Taiwan. So our museum start to upload our collection to put them into the system, and then to let players can kind of decorate their space, online the virtual space, with our collection. So these are just some examples. And then in the southern branch, we built up our own museum island in the Animal Crossing video game. And we built our, so the educator in our museum, they built an island based on the actual park design in our museum, as well as our collection. For example, like this is an actual slide in our museum park. And the design on it is based on one of our collection. It's a batik from Indonesia. So we have like this kind of little things for our online visitors can kind of play with us on the in the Animal Crossing. And also we kind of organizing that kind of open day for our museum island to invite visitors to come over to our museum, and then we give them like a virtual tour in the Animal Crossing game space. And then we let them to kind of try on our museum collection in the game. So during that time, it's like giving them an online tour and invite everyone to play together. And also, we also kind of using the social media to use our own collection, and then to tell people like about social distance or some of the new updates about the pandemic issues. Thank you.
Thank you. And Julia?
Yeah, we've had a slightly different situation here, that we shut down in March. Sorry, I should explain, here in the Czech Republic at the National Gallery Prague. So we shut down in mid-March. The Czech Republic was quite ahead of a lot of other countries in kind of closing everything down. And it meant that we actually reopened in mid-May. So we only had quite a kind of short period when we were shut. Having said that, we're now having a belated first wave, so we're hoping we won't have to shut down again after that. So during that time, like others have said, we had produced online content that was successful. One of those was a virtual tour I did for an exhibition that had recently opened, and that's because of the pandemic and because there wasn't really enough content they were finding on TV. Even though we produced it for social media, the Czech TV came and did a report about it for the nightly news, and that inspired someone at the TV station to actually pick it up for broadcast on national TV. So through that, we actually, you know, ended up promoting the museum far wider, ended up getting out this exhibition and the artist that it was a retrospective of to kind of lots of people's living room. So that was really positive, and it's also been released online. We've had some good international feedback. So like Carmen said, it introduced more opportunity for international engagement. But you know, we've obviously experienced problems like other institutions. Prague is heavily reliant on tourism. There's been about 90% drop in tourism. So obviously that's affected our tourist numbers. Also the impact that's had on the local economy has obviously had an impact on our local audiences and who can attend. So that's impacted our budgets. The National Gallery was already going through something of a financial and management crisis. So it sort of compounded that. And I don't know whether it's actually a positive or a negative, but it basically kind of created this crisis point to start cutting programming, which was something that probably needs to happen before, but just to get things back on an even keel. But the the pandemic caused that to happen. So we cut the entire rest of the 2020 exhibitions program, and then it's been cut. Future programming into future years has also been reduced. So obviously that's been very impactful on everyone, and everyone's sort of struggling to deal with that. And some shows had a financial commitment, and so they were prioritized, which has caused other issues. We've avoided redundancies so far. That's not something that culturally or sort of legally here would be prioritized. So we've got a full staff, and we've kind of needed them because of everything starting back in May.
Great, thanks everyone. It's really interesting to hear how different institutions have been dealing with this over the last few months. On to the next question. So in recent months, there have been many conversations about how exhibition making might change following the pandemic, as institutions face increased financial difficulties and shifting logistical parameters regarding both exhibiting work and welcoming visitors. How can exhibition development and production better reflect the global shifts that have occurred as a result of the pandemic? And can you share with us any relevant examples? Laura, should we start with you?
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, we aren't a sort of stereotypical institution. So as with a lot of other programs, we've managed to avoid making the sort of active decisions to postpone or cancel, apart from our touring exhibition that was due to open. I think it was actually the weekend that the UK went into lockdown, so that was the worst timing ever. That was an exhibition called Breaking the Mould, Sculpture by Women since 1945. So we've been very lucky with that, being able to literally postpone the entire tour for 1 year because the venues just happened to work out with their schedules. But otherwise, we're actually responding to other institutions' decisions mostly as a lending organisation. So we have a lot of dates that have been postponed. A few have been cancelled, but mostly postponed or extended. But I think generally the logistical parameters that have changed, I think it's a sector that's based on sort of a hyper-connectedness and a mobility of people and items. So I think anything that interrupts that is going to have a big influence. We don't know for how long. But I think in general, we're going to see sparser exhibition programs, longer dates for exhibitions, and also probably longer lead times. And time in for preparation and sign off, because there will be so much more thought having to go into health and safety and protocols and things like that. I know Carmen's mentioned that they're certainly going to do it at the Smithsonian American Art Museum, a greater focus on permanent collections. Obviously those institutions that have them, those that don't, I think we will see a big request, certainly places like Arts Council collection where I am, of requests for touring exhibitions, because predominantly they are ready to go. That means that they are time, labour and budget efficient. So when places are looking for quick turnarounds and a show that they don't necessarily need to put a lot of the preparation into, I think they will become really, really popular. Obviously, we have a question later about things like blockbusters and big ticket items. Arguably, they might reduce, but that's a whole different question later. I think as well, we'll see a bigger, or hopefully we will see a greater sort of concentration on community-focused content, whether that's digital or physical. I know the place that I used to work in Manchester, the Lowry, they're doing an exhibition that started off as a digital exhibition, and they are now doing it as a physical exhibition, which is based on local residents' reactions and responses to the coronavirus. And I know that online there's places like the Royal Academy, whose sort of social media presence used to be quite academic and quite serious, has become a bit more contributor based. So I think they had the hashtag Daily Doodle, where I think they would put out something like, you know, squirrels wearing slippers or something like that, and have people send in and tweet their drawings. So I think that sort of more democratic approach to content will prevail a little more. I've also seen that, I know we did a couple of virtual exhibitions, but certainly institutions that have greater capacity and budget for those sorts of things, I think we will see much more of those. I know I read some stats about the British Museum and the Courtauld. I think the Courtauld saw a 73% spike in engagement in their digital exhibitions over lockdown. So I think that hopefully people will continue some of that work. And also sort of going along the virtual lines, I saw a Q&A just before I started speaking about how we're handling couriering. Mostly our touring shows stay within the UK, though our loans do go internationally. We haven't had any international loans since the lockdown, but we've been doing installations and couriering digitally. So using platforms like Skype and Zoom to have our technicians speak directly to borrowing institutions' technicians, and also sort of sit on the sidelines whilst condition checks are being done, essentially. So I think as much as we often like to travel to new places to take a, you know, something, I think that will become a more common practice. Obviously, there is the issue of whether you draw a line at certain points, whether works above a certain cost would be exempt from that, and you would still need to send a physical courier. I think that, you know, considerations like that will still need to be made. And also I think generally museums are going to tend towards exhibitions that create spaces, spaces for dialogue, for collaboration, for discussion, and people just engaging with each other, because I think that's what people have missed and are missing. So, you know, a lot of people might not necessarily see too much difference in potentially seeing an artwork on a screen as opposed to in person. You know, some people will go to a museum because of the social aspect of it and to see people and to be with others. And I think that is something that no matter how hard we try, we will really struggle to replicate online. So I think that idea of creating space, usable space, will become a bigger thing with exhibition development.
Great, thanks, Laura. Julia, do you have any comments for this question?
Yeah, so I relocated from London to Prague about 2 years ago, which is a kind of slightly unusual direction of travel. And one thing I've been really struck with is how resourceful people are, because there isn't, you know, and working in big institutions in London, there was this emphasis I found on international loans. You know, I felt like a lot of people thought an exhibition sort of wasn't a proper exhibition without a big international loan, without a lot of money being spent on it. This is very different. You know, over here, it's international loans are seen as a privilege, not an expectation. And if you're loaning works internationally, it means someone else isn't going to be able to loan works in the institution. So for their exhibition. So, you know, it's a very different starting point, and I think in a way that makes people better prepared here and in other parts of the world outside that transatlantic kind of wealth bubble where, you know, the funding goes to. It makes them sort of better prepared to deal with this. I found people here very resourceful in making do, reusing materials from previous exhibitions, you know, kind of thinking about making do, you know, what do we need, how can we minimize costs? And I'm starting working on an exhibition of Viktor Pivovarov, a retrospective, and we're hoping to loan some works from Russia, which is quite a kind of, you know, thing we wouldn't necessarily normally be able to do. We're hoping to have a sponsor supporters doing that. But, you know, in terms of his works that are held in exhibitions in the US, that's not something we can consider. So we have to think about how we can tell the stories in other ways, how we can represent them, you know, whether we have to remake works, whether we have to use alternative resources such as videos or digital content as well.
Thanks, Julia. That's led us very nicely onto our next question, which is many institutions are reliant on blockbuster exhibitions to draw visitors. However, the many issues presented by the pandemic means that large blockbuster exhibitions will for the foreseeable future be much more challenging to stage. How might such institutions find alternative ways of assembling exhibitions, for instance, by drawing more upon their own collections or by partnering with local institutions? And Carmen, could you start for this one?
Sure. I think for Sam, this has really meant, you know, finding ways to make exhibitions more affordable and trying to reach as many people as possible, which means, you know, much longer exhibition periods, you know, some lasting between 8 months to a year, you know, where possible. This is the case with an exhibition that I'm about to open, Printing the Revolution, which is opening in November and closing in August of next year. And, you know, and we've also considered with our timing, the sort of, you know, the content of this exhibition and how it may particularly appeal to Chicanx and Latinx audiences who are really have been disproportionately impacted by COVID. So another reason to extend the exhibition is because we want these audiences to be able to access this exhibition and hopefully can visit at a time when the pandemic is more under control. I think we've also been looking into turning existing exhibitions into you know, digital content. So for this exhibition, we'll be creating our first virtual digital tour that is based on 360 photography that will allow visitors to sort of, you know, self-navigate themselves through the exhibition space in a virtual way. And like other institutions, we've been, you know, cutting back on expensive international loans for future exhibitions. And probably most importantly for us is, you know, over the next few years, we have really privileged and emphasized exhibitions drawn from our permanent collection, you know, as a way to deal with the sort of economic, you know, uncertainties of the coming years.
Great, thank you. G? Oh, sorry, you're on mute.
I'm sorry, okay. In our museums, we originally, like, there will be 3 international exhibitions in 1 year. So it's kind of like a heavy duty for all of us. But due to the pandemic, a lot of things have to be changed, and curators have to respond like promptly. For example, like we have a long exhibition that need to return to its original country in January. However, due to all the travel limitation, so we have to do a lot of adapt a lot of changes in a very short period of time. And another case is an exhibition called the Hubilihan. It's about the incarnated lamas of the Qing Dynasty and related artifact. Originally, we will have very beautiful things from Mongolia to Taiwan, but due to the pandemic, we kind of, I think we are aware of, and then we confirmed that their collection cannot reach us about, I think, like May. But the museum, the exhibition will open in August. So all the curators have to rearrange everything and then to rewrite all the storyline in order to put the things on time to open. So we kind of like, I know all the curators for that exhibition, they work like crazy and they go back to our system to go back to the storage and then to kind of like screen everything we have and then try to make a sensible and attractive new storyline for that exhibition. And like, luckily we do like have many things from the storage, and as well as we also contact with local Mongolian and Tibetan community, as well as some associations, and they kindly loan us some of their collection as well, and also the portrait of the incarnating lamas. So we can like luckily have that exhibition open on time. And for some reason, I think like because also because we decided to do a sand mandala in a gallery, and we have like a time lapse film for that and play it in the gallery. And we received many positive feedback from the audience, because this is more like a religious art exhibition. And at this very difficult time for for everyone, many visitors, they respond to us like they kind of felt some kind of peaceful and then kind of positive feeling and then like energy when after they visit that exhibition, about like they kind of like it very much. So I think that is something like we kind of didn't expect when we heard that, oh, we are lacking of a lot of the international loan in May. Yep. So I think like one thing I would like to share is like the pandemic might, although like everyone are suffering for that, but it's also maybe a good time for us to find out some of the unknown beauty, unknown collection of our own. And then also we can find a new interpretation of the sunset of collection. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm aware that the clock is ticking, so I'm just going to move on to the next question to make sure we have some time for Q&A at the end. The reduction in international travel has meant for many large organisations a significant reduction in visitor numbers and the need to engage more with local audiences. Alongside the reality and challenges presented by the pandemic, the events of the last year have prompted renewed debate around who is welcome, served and represented by institutions. In light of this, what does good community practice and engagement look like in a socially distanced world, and how can that be folded into exhibition making? Julia, could we start with you for this one?
Yes, yeah, obviously I absolutely support the idea that museums should represent society and that everyone should be able to enter a museum and see their contribution to the wider society represented proportionally within that that museum, and you know, we must acknowledge that often doesn't happen, and there's still a lot of work to be done. I mean, my experience from working in London is people, you know, institutions and often the directorates particularly, they paid lip service to this all the time, but then there was still a lot of pressure on us all the time to increase visitor numbers, to increase funding, to increase levels of engagement. There was always this pressure for more, but the resources weren't being given to us to do that. So, you know, the staffing levels stayed the same, the budget stayed the same, or usually reduced. And yes, you know, we've been told, oh, we're aiming to bring in yet another, you know, 500,000 people or something this year. And I really felt people were getting more and more frazzled. They were getting more burnout from this. And then at the same time, people would say, oh yes, but we also want, you know, the museum to be more diverse. And it's not, you know, it's not that making the museum more open to people actually, more open to everyone actually involves funding. I don't think it's that. I think it's this pressure to always kind of bring more people in that actually just distracts people's thoughts. You know, they just don't have the time to think about how to reformulate their programs and their exhibitions and kind of broaden it out, I think, often when there's kind of these other pressures. So I think there's a great opportunity here for, you know, people, if this is something that people really genuinely believe is important, which I think is, the majority of people do feel that across the sector, this is an opportunity for us to actually make positive change now, and to actually stop kind of putting these kind of top-down pressures to always do more in terms of money and in terms of just general, you know, footfall.
Thank you, MT.
As I mentioned earlier, like our new branch was it's not in the urban area. It's actually it's like in a township, and so we don't have a lot of museum goer or like locally. So I think and then we always been criticized by like how many visitor number we have, because we have like a very strong comparison with our northern branch. What we trying to do is like, especially during the pandemic, we kind of organize more events, especially outdoor events. So for example, this summer, we use drone to have like a night display for our collection. So we to say like, so it's more like we use drone to kind of make it into the pattern of our famous collection. And because like a lot of the Taiwanese people, they are a big fan of like technology or new things. They are not a big fan of like ancient art. So we use those new technology and to use drone to make animation in the sky in order to draw the people into the museum park. Because I think our southern branch, we have a new strategy. It's like we have to attract people to our museum park first, and then we allure them into our galleries. If they just don't feel we are part of the community, part of their life, then they don't even bother to visit. We have more visitors from other cities than local. So I think this year we start to apply this strategy, actually it's from the last year. And then we find like really good result of it, because I think like all our neighbors, they became like aware of that. And last week I went to a local restaurant, and then the shop owner told me, the restaurant owner told me that her granddaughter keep asking her to take her to our museum. And that is something we kind of begging them to bring their children before, and they don't. They say, oh, we need to make money, we don't have time. But now it's like their grandchildren or their children are asking them to bring them to the museum. So I think like that is something we try, and we found it quite efficient to engage with the local people. Thank you.
Thank you. And Laura?
Yeah, I think, to be honest, I think quite a lot's been covered already, but I think in terms of what true and authentic sort of community practice and engagement looks like, I think the reason that some institutions don't do it as successfully as others is that there is considerable time and resource needed to really embed and commit to community work. You know, that sort of idea of legacy and longevity, rather than doing an event and then moving on, sort of ticking that box and then going on to the next thing that you need to achieve. And I think that's, you know, on this idea of the ladder of participation, you know, authentic, real engagement isn't just getting somebody in, asking them to draw a picture, taking a photo, putting it on social media, and then never seeing them again. You know, we need to start giving people who we expect to spend their time, potentially money and effort and emotions on our collections, we need to give them the, you know, genuine choices and genuine involvement, rather than this surface level engagement where we then think that we can say we've engaged with people when actually we haven't at all, or not in a true sense. So I think that is that sort of embedding into an organisation and committing to something is really important. And I think a lot of institutions are moving away from it now, but I think that we used to have the case, and it still is in, you know, a lot of institutions, where the sort of learning and engagement department and then the curatorial department sit in silos, and one does one job and one does the other job. But I think now, and hopefully more so after, with the results of the pandemic, and everything else that 2020 has brought with it, I think those silos need to be brought together so that we can have dynamic workforces that actually bounce off each other and collaborate to make sure that communities that are engaged in one manner are carried through organisations and through time. And I think that will help specifically local audiences feel a real sense of trust and ownership.
Great, thank you very much. Just to move on to our last question before we go to Q&A, exhibitions are a major source of revenue for many museums, meaning that for various related reasons, subjects chosen often focus on attracting sponsorship and large admission revenue. Given the events of the last year, what do you think the future of exhibition programming will look like? And can we start with you, Carmen?
Sure. I think one of the things that I've been thinking about is that, of course, we're still in the middle of this pandemic, so it's kind of like hard to really fully answer this question when you're still in it. So I think that, depending on how soon economies and institutions can really financially recover from this period and re-up their staff in some instances, I think it's going to be very difficult for institutions to mount large, expensive loan exhibitions. I think for this reason, I think institutions will need to focus more on their permanent collections, which doesn't mean that those exhibitions are less ambitious or important, but rather that they're smarter, they're more creative, and they're more strategic in helping institutions sort of invest internally. And I think that, obviously given the pandemic and in the United States, the simultaneous racial pandemic, right, that has become very visible, has really led us to really think about audiences in a different way and to prioritize that in terms of our mission and resources. I think that there is going to be a hunger, there is a hunger, and there's going to be a greater need for exhibitions by Black, Indigenous, and artists of color, that there's going to be a greater need for projects that tell different national and global narratives that either integrate the perspectives of people of color or privilege these perspectives outright. I also think that this is an opportune moment for curators and scholars who are knowledgeable in these fields, and that their work can take center stage. The questions that we're asking in this regard are not new. They've been around for decades. I think what has changed is that they are now seen as topics for a more mainstream audience, and this is an opportunity that I think that that is dynamic and that has a lot of possibilities. So I'm excited to see what the future holds in that regard, even though there's still a sense that we don't know how much institutions are going to commit to that. I think I think also that I'm thinking about some of the things that she was saying about an exhibition or works that she presented at her museum, and I think that there's also going to need for cultural institutions to provide some kind of emotional healing, for our communities. What will that look like? I don't know, but I think that art can play that role. And art can play a role, obviously, in presenting narratives of justice. So I think that these are also questions and issues that I hope exhibitions in the future will address.
Thank you, Carmen. Julia?
Yeah, I've been thinking about the fact that obviously just in our daily lives, people have had to adapt, and a lot of that has involved kind of thinking about what can be done online. How do we have to kind of move physically around as much as well, and that sort of like technological leap is maybe something that can be reflected in the exhibitions as well. I mean, something I've been thinking about for quite a few years about how, you know, this idea of user-generated content, how people actually engage with culture, and how they increasingly expect to be provided with a platform in order to create their own images, in order to kind of share their own voices. That's something you're seeing, obviously, with the rise of social media, and it's creating a kind of growing gap, I think, with the museum sector, which is still kind of, a lot of which still follows this kind of quite didactic idea of, you know, one person coming up with a concept and communicating it down to people. So, I mean, that's something I'd like to see develop more, and it has the added benefit that, you know, it's lower cost as long as there's the actual investment in the kind of technological resources. You know, some of the things I've seen, I think it was at the Rubin Museum in New York, where when you go in, you're given an envelope, and it's kind of got a message from a previous visitor saying what they particularly enjoyed about the museum, or one thing they particularly, you know, thought you should think about or go and see in something. And I like that idea of that sort of content, you know, which is actually, you put it in place, and then the actual kind of visitors feed into it, and they're creating the content. And there are other ways, I think, in which that can work and actually make the museum a more kind of interactive, collaborative, engaging space for everyone.
Great, thank you everyone for sharing your thoughts on this interesting topic. The time has moved on, so we're now going to move on to the Q&A, as we have some great questions that have been submitted. And the first one I wanted to start with is a popular one in the Q&A feed. What are the panelists' thoughts on virtual exhibitions that are viewed solely online? Has any institutions had an experience using a specific platform for these types of exhibitions? Who would like to start on that one? Laura, perhaps?
In terms of personal experience, I can't say as I can be all that useful. As I mentioned, with our sort of staffing and budgets, we've tended to stick to sort of a 360 tour, but it's just filmed, so it becomes a small film. So I don't have any experience of specific platforms, I'm afraid. But in terms of experience in online exhibitions, I think there is a tendency to think that putting something online means that it's accessible to everybody, which I think is the danger. Obviously, I mentioned earlier that there is this digital poverty, and just because most of us have access to, you know, laptops or the internet, that doesn't mean that everybody does, or even if they do, it doesn't mean that they're confident in using it, or would even potentially know that you can view exhibitions online. Personally, I mean, I'm very old school. I still print everything out so I can read it on paper rather than reading it on a screen. So I'm not the best person for online exhibitions, but I do think that they serve a purpose, and that there is an element of that breaking down of a threshold fear that confronts most people when they consider going to a major institution. Obviously, speaking as people within the sector, we probably can't really empathise with that. But I know from the background I was from a rural background of absolutely zero knowledge or experience of the arts. And I still watch my parents look absolutely terrified as they walk up to a gallery, and I know full well they wouldn't go in it without me. So I think having that digital access within the space and the safety of your own home, in your dressing gown, allows people to sort of make that first step and then potentially decide that they want to make a physical visit. And if they don't, then they haven't spent their money and emotional, you know, turmoil on getting to somewhere that they then feel uncomfortable in. So I think personally, I don't necessarily think that you can replicate the physical online completely, but I do think that it serves a really important purpose for a certain demographic and a certain way to navigate issues that we do have in the sector.
Thank you, Laura. Would anyone else like Julia?
I was just going to make a quick point. I mean, I'd love to see more virtual content and virtual exhibitions, but in an institution like mine where we have 7 historical buildings that all need upkeep, that's a huge challenge. I mean, and a lot of museums have the same issue. I mean, the majority of the money goes into keeping these buildings working. I mean, even in the fanciest museums, often, you know, there's water coming through the ceiling. I think that's been an issue in every institution I've worked in, or certainly half of them. You know, all of those sort of things, those sort of upkeep, those have to be maintained, even, you know, even if everything is happening online. So, you know, I just kind of wanted to acknowledge that's a huge pressure on everyone in terms of producing or being able to move over to develop other sorts of content.
I think, as I mentioned, you know, we will be producing our first virtual tour, 360 virtual tour for an exhibition that we're opening in November, which is something that we hadn't planned before the pandemic, but with the pandemic, we shifted gears. So that's not going to be available until like January of next year. And really the idea with that is really to create a twin of the exhibition. So it's not just you know, a sort of a virtual exhibition that only exists in virtual space, but it is something that we've already invested in a sort of, you know, bricks and mortar kind of way. So I think that's in terms of, you know, some of the issues of, you know, resources that Julia was mentioning, I think that is a real concern, right? And, you know, to have the staff to be able to create these independent exhibitions, it's more likely that we will be creating things related to exhibitions that exist already, or that will be worked on in a physical way.
Thank you. I think that, oh, sorry, Chi.
I think in the case of my museum, we already have planned for the 360-degree like a street shot, and our museum also collaborate with Google Art and also Google Street View. However, we do think like to view our 10 galleries online cannot really replace the actual feeling of visiting a museum and then to stand in front of the artwork. Because I think like it's the feeling we also, because maybe I'm old school as well, so I cannot remember maybe that kind of very touching and then heart beating when I standing in front of like a really beautiful object, and then that kind of direct eye contact with the artwork. And that is something I cannot, get if I'm just like browsing on my iPad. It's still, for me, I think it's different. But the reason why we need to do that kind of like 60-degree filming for our audience is because now we are competing with a lot of attractions, and to let them have a taste or like a preview of gallery of the things they will gonna to see. We found it through visitor studies, they will feel like more comfortable if they can have a preview of what they're going to see. Then when they actually see it, they will feel more satisfied. Because a lot of our visitors, they might not be so familiar with the artwork. So when they actually see it, they don't really have that kind of feeling. Although I personally do believe an artwork will talk by itself, even like just right there. But I think right now we are in the age of like that kind of people don't have that much time to kind of have the inner communication with our collection. So we, as a curator, I think like we need to do something to help them to reconnect with the artwork. That's my point of view. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. I think this leads us nicely onto another question in the Q&A, which says, in your virtual programming, how are you taking advantage of technologies, making it more possible to draw audiences in for a closer look at objects that would be otherwise inaccessible to large public audiences? Who would like to start on this one? Perhaps Carmen again.
Yeah, sure. I think that we are looking to sort of create digital programs that have been in-person programs at our buildings. We have, very successful, we have a wonderful program called Double Take, where we join a curator with a scholar from another field, kind of exploring a work of art in depth, from multiple perspectives. So this has led to, the creation, even before the pandemic, of a series of, of videos that are visible on our YouTube channel, where you can do this kind of very deep dive into, a work of art from a variety of perspectives in a very accessible way. Since the pandemic, we have been shifting to create what we've been calling American Art Moments, where you have, again, our curators identifying a work that is either a new acquisition or something has become increasingly relevant. So it's allowed us to sort of be a bit more nimble with current events, and sort of have that be a tape session where, again, you do a sort of a digital deep dive, close-ups of works of art. And this is something that we started doing, again, in a virtual way in response to the pandemic, but is something that could continue into the future, even beyond that, because it becomes an evergreen resource that's accessible, to people in remote places.
Julia?
I don't think I have anything specific to add. I was just thinking about something slightly tangential, which is when I did this virtual tour, I was being interviewed for this nightly news afterwards, and I think they were really trying to encourage me to say, oh yes, virtual exhibitions can replace, visiting the exhibition in person, and I feel like Chi, that I really still feel that it can't be replicated. I've seen lots of institutions try to try, and it just doesn't seem to be something that works, but it can be very informative, and like someone said, this idea of Laura said about kind of, it's a great way to kind of prepare someone for going to the exhibition, and she said as well, and then kind of be ready to get more out of the exhibition. But one thing I mentioned in that interview is in the news, and it was funny because they actually cut what I said to put a positive spin on it, because they needed something, I was making the point that when someone else is videoing and you can't navigate the work in the way you would normally, so it's someone else's perspective and how they walk around the work, the things that they actually zoom in on, how you actually walk around the exhibition, so it kind of takes away that sort of ownership in actually kind of getting to know the exhibition or getting to know the works. So, it would be great if there was some sort of technology that allowed people to actually kind of, navigate themselves around. I don't know whether it exists and whether it's cost prohibitive, but that would be great, because that's something that, we're taking that away from people through these virtual exhibitions often.
I think that's the goal of the 360 tour, is that it's a self-directed virtual visit through an exhibition. So it is the idea that the person who's touring has the control of where to go. I can go this way or that way, or whichever way you want.
Great, thank you everyone. Unfortunately, we've run out of time today, so I'd like to bring this conversation to a close. However, this discussion has been really rich, inspiring and thought-provoking, and has surfaced many great ideas and case studies for us all to go away and consider. Before we finish, I would just like to thank our speakers for their time today, and for our audience for attending and providing us with many great questions and comments, and apologies again that we weren't able to answer all of those. I would also like to thank the rest of the cohort of the International Engagement Programme for Curators, as well as Judith, Monica and Casey from the AAMC for their support and work organising this seminar. And finally, I would like to thank the Association of Art Museum Curators, the Art Fund and the Terra Foundation for American Art for this programme. Many thanks for joining us today, and I hope you have a good rest of your day.
Hello, I'm Monica Valenzuela, Program Manager for AAMC and AAMC Foundation. Thank you for joining our program today, and a special thanks to our speakers for sharing their experience and expertise with us. A recording will be available on our website, artcurators.org, and our YouTube channel shortly. Please help support our capacity to continue programs such as today's event by making a donation today. A gift of any amount will have a direct impact on our work. Thank you, stay well, and join us again soon.